All right, let's see. You good to go? Good to get started? Hmm. Okay. All right. Thank you so much for responding. Is it Gerge? Gerge? Is that how you pronounce it? Gerge? Oh, great. I've spent all weekend practicing, so I thought I'd come. Felt bad about last week. All right. Here we go. Sorry for the delay. We're all set up in Calgary. Everyone's good to go there, and we're going to talk about more CSS. Originally, the lecture that I was asked to give is called CSS is not easy. I just shortened it a little bit. CSS is hard. So let's talk about maybe some of the things that we think might make CSS hard. What do we think might make CSS hard? Why might I call it hard? Yeah. A lot of rules. Okay. Yeah, a lot of rules. And I think a lot of rules, they got added slowly over time without old rules being removed. And so now you have uncertainty is which rules you should follow, which ones are still accurate, which ones are just... Yes, that makes things like this hard. CSS is not the only thing that suffers from this, but it definitely is one of those prominent ones we have to deal with, right? Any other reasons CSS might be hard? Okay, so understanding the difference of... yeah, like how apply... Right, there might be complex rules that define how styles get applied to certain elements, and in order to be able to make a decision about where we put those styles, we have to learn those rules. We have to, yeah, I think so. I think that understanding why a style is being applied, or maybe why a style isn't being applied to something, is something we have to get good at, and I like those tools to help debug with that. That's without those Chrome development tools, I'm lost after that, right? Yeah, I use that quite a bit. So CSS could be considered hard. It's not JavaScript, so we're moving from, but it is a language that actually has, even as it gets added to, there's a lot of, you can do calculations in there, you can do some types of inheritance and stuff like that, but it's not like a programming language like we've been used to so far. And I think one of the things that makes CSS hard is that sometimes properties are only available depending on some situation that you've put an element into. So I'm going to show you some of those. Position properties, for example. There's only some properties only work if an element is positioned. Okay, well, let's learn what that means to be a positioned element and what those properties are. But I think that makes it hard. It's like I might try and attach a property to something and it doesn't do anything, and I'm thinking, why is that? And I realize, okay, I have to attach these two properties together for that to actually work. So we'll go over position, and we'll talk a little bit about positioned elements and some of these new properties that we can be given based on that. Specificity. Specificity is about being able to calculate based on your selector list what sort of priority that style will have compared to another rule that might have a different selector list. We can compare those things and find out which one is more specific, and the more specific thing is actually what would get applied. So we could learn some of those rules to try and make CSS a bit easier. And then I'd like to spend sort of the second half on layouts and just talking about how we can apply some of these concepts we learned this morning to actually making layouts, because to me that's the most important thing of CSS. Okay. So position, this is a new, so we have display, block, inline, that's one thing. There's also position, and position, by default, all elements are positioned as static. They're called static. That's the position property. But there are other options. These aren't even all of them, but these are the most common ones. So by default, every element that you create, unless you change its position property, will have the property of static. Okay? And that's the behavior that we've been seeing so far. My block level elements, my inline elements, some of them drop to the next line, some of them flow horizontally. All of that is sort of dictated by the position being static. That's why it does it that way, is that that's the behavior of a statically positioned element. But you can make any element you want, you can convert it to be what we'll call positioned. It would be a positioned element if you applied relative, absolute, or fixed positioning to that property as a value, okay? So static is, I've got three things in a row like this, it'll just kind of lay out in that row. The location of the second thing depends on the width and location of the first thing. That's, so this would be, I will call this the natural flow of layout, for lack of a better. The static does a natural kind of flow of layout based on the size of my browser. But then we can make this element positioned. So we say position property, colon, relative. Now we've just made this a positioned element, and we gain access to top, left, right, and bottom properties now. which we don't have on static elements, but once we make them positioned, we have those things. And so a element that is positioned relatively, what it'll do is it would go into it would be rendered into the natural flow of the layout where it would if it were a static image. But if we add a top, left, right, or bottom, it's going to offset it from where its origin would have been if it was static. Is that an okay way to put it? Right? If it was this element, well, it's just going to sit there. I can't put top or left on it. It just stays there. But as soon as I make it a positioned element, it would still get rendered there, but then we'll offset it a little bit from that location. So a relatively positioned element, once it has top, left, bottom, or right properties, it's going to be moved that number of pixels based on where its origin would have been if it were a static element. Okay. I don't have, this is just the way things are. So I don't know why they called it relative. I mean, it kind of makes sense that relative to where it's going to be offset relative to where it would have been positioned statically, maybe. I don't know. We've also got this concept of absolute. So instead of relative, I could position it as absolute. And this is slightly different behavior. What are we noticing here? Yeah, that it doesn't get positioned first based on the natural layout flow. It's not relative to anything. We're absolutely saying that your top and your left is, well, in this case, it's showing that it's based on the container. So the container that it's in, I've got this element in a container. We're offsetting it from the origin of that container by 20 pixels in both directions. So absolute, that'll act a little bit different than relative. But it also gains those top and left properties, right? So then there's also this one about fixed. And fixed is it will be rendered naturally where it would if it was a static element. It'll still get rendered there. But then when you start to scroll the page, it'll stay exactly where it was in the overall viewport. Right? So let's look at what these things actually behave like. In the notes, we've got the position file. So I'm going to open that up. And these are all those elements that I was dealing with here. And I'm going to I'll keep this full screen here so we can actually read it. And we want position. No, we don't want. We want the other. What's going on here? This is, that's it. Okay, good. Looked a lot more like, this actually looked like my morning lecture. I didn't put a lot of thought in it. Okay, there we go. So here's a bunch of CSS. Some of it is only just to make this look a little bit nicer. But the part that we care about exists pretty much here. So I've got this thing for div offset. It's just saying anything that's positioned, I can now give it a top and left. So if I give it an offset class, that element would be offset by 20 pixels. I can change the position of an element to absolute, relative, or fixed. And there's this concept of being a positioned element. So I'll try and show you what that means as well. Okay, so we'll start off at the top here and just see that all of these elements, they are just regular static, let me grab the tools. They are statically positioned elements, including this one here. If I go to computed, I believe show all, I have to go to show all here. So if you are curious about what styles actually got applied to your element, then I go over to the computed section, not the styles section, because this gives me a list of the styles as they get applied, and the ones on top, that's what I think gets applied. But the computed section of this tool here, this shows me what values everything actually got after all that cascading happened. Okay. So I should be able to go in here and find that position element, or position property. And I can see the position of that element is, by default, static. Okay. If I grab this one here, I can see its position has been overwritten, and it is position absolute. Okay. So let's start going through each one of these. I'm going to start with the absolute one. All right. So normal, if this was just a normal static element, it would just get rendered in the natural flow of the layout there. But we're going to make some changes to it. We're going to actually say that this is now absolutely positioned. And when I do that, what changed? Okay, I can go back and show you. So I'm going to refresh now. Remember, we only care about this section here, so keep your eyes on this, okay? 3, 2, 1, reload. Okay, I'll go back. Keep your eye on it again. I'm making it absolutely positioned now. Watch it. Refresh. What happened? Did that element disappear? Behind, exactly. Nailed it, right? It is behind this highlighted element. Because when I make something absolute like this, sure, it's still laid out based on that. If I don't give it an offset, it's still going to be positioned there. But it's brought up in front of everything else, and other stuff is going to flow behind. It does not actually have any impact to the layout of the other static elements there. Okay, so that's something we have to learn about, absolutely. And don't worry if none of this makes sense, because it doesn't make sense to me either. I just have to follow these. Yes, of course. Absolutely positioned elements. So I'm about to add an offset to it, which is going to change things quite a bit. Let's see what happens when I add an offset, right? Because that actually is going to change when I add a top and I left property, it's going to change even this. It's not right here. It's like, okay, yeah, sure, I'll go where I would have gone normally. But if I add an offset to this, okay, watch carefully. Okay, where'd it go? Yeah, it's all the way up. So my viewport is starts up here, and it ends down here, and I have X and Y coordinates all the way down the whole thing, and this is sitting at 20 pixels from the top, 20 pixels from the left, and it's an absolute position element. So as we can see, it's going to be positioned absolutely within the viewport. If I make it, if I make the instead of the top and left, I make the bottom and the right. Well, now it's going to be down there in the bottom right corner, because it's just being absolutely positioned within my viewport based on those top, left, bottom, and right properties that I give it. I think if I give it another one of these, it actually, I'm not sure if this overwrites the width or not. No, it doesn't. It doesn't care about it. But it looks like there is a precedence. I haven't got into details with that. Yeah, I mean, exactly. Like, what? Maybe there's a built-in priority. I mean, for me, let me just bring it up now. Use absolute positioning sparingly. That's all. That's maybe why I haven't gone into detail on that, is because it's like, I need to use this sparingly. Because if I start making everything absolute, everything's going to be pixel values. I have no responsiveness in my UI anymore, right? I have to now write JavaScript to figure out how to resize elements that are absolutely sized and positioned. So there are use cases for absolute, but just because we can set the pixels, we can put it anywhere we want on the screen, doesn't mean it's the simple solution to making CSS look the way that we want. Usually, by doing this a whole bunch, you start building up this big problem for you that you never kind of recover from, because now everything's absolutely positioned. You have to change a whole bunch of your site just to make one thing work. We want to stay away from that. So be careful with absolute. It is not the solution to all of our layout problems, especially with this, especially with responsive design being as important as it is. Okay. So let's keep going and say, okay, we'll go back to this. Now, I'm going to show you one more thing about absolute positioning that's important to know, because this allows us to position it absolutely within the viewport. But what if I want to position it absolutely within its container, the container that it's in, right? I want to position it down there in that other box over here. I want it to be in this box instead, not in the viewport. I want it to be relative to the container that it's in. We can actually do that as well. We can make the parent container. So this is absolute here. We can make the parent container a positioned element. So all I've done is make the container that holds these boxes a relatively positioned element. Now, because it's relatively positioned and I don't have any offset, it's just naturally put into that location that it would have normally, right? And it pushes the things after it to the right side as well. Things don't go behind it. So when I do this, what we end up with is maybe that behavior where an absolutely positioned element is actually positioned based on its closest positioned parent. Okay, so when I say positioned parent, I mean this is the element. This is the absolute element right here. When I look up to my parent, I look at this div. It is the next highest positioned element. It's not statically positioned, so it is a positioned element. This would be true for relative, absolute, and fixed. They're positioned elements. So, okay, that makes sense. I could also, I could take it up here to the body. I could make that positioned. Really what it does is it just looks up, finds a position element, and then it absolutely positions it relative to that element. Sorry about that. It absolutely positions it relative to that element. The naming's not great as far as I'm concerned with these things. Because when I have to say stuff like that it's absolutely positioned relative to its parent element, that's kind of weird. So that's absolute. If you're going to use it, probably worth playing in like a code pen or something like that, trying some of the things out and seeing how it's behaving. That's how I got used to this, is just put it in there and add properties, remove properties, click these little things here, turn them on and off, and see what happens when you actually affect these things. That's how I learned CSS, because reading articles is pretty dry. I feel like I don't actually get all those details, and with CSS we have to understand some of those details. Okay, we're good there. So I'm going to move down next to the next one, which is just this fixed container here. And I'm just going to show you that it's positioned, again, same kind of thing as absolute, because there's a box behind it, right? Two boxes stacked on top of each other. So fixed has that property. What happens if we take a fixed element and put it inside a positioned, okay. Doesn't seem to care, I think, right? Doesn't seem to care. It's still fixed. Yeah? That makes sense? That's where, and if I don't know. Yeah. Okay. So this is something you're going to use fixed for Tweeter, right? You're going to use this for your nav bar at the top, so that when you scroll, your tweets all go underneath it. So that's when we're definitely going to be having you use positioning. You should be able to get away without setting... I don't have 100% certainty, but very close, that you should be able to get away with not using absolute on anything in Tweeter. Okay. But you will have to use fixed for that other functionality. And there is another option here. I think sticky is another one. Sticky... let's say MDN sticky position. I don't know. That's gross, maybe. But I just got to make sure I put MDN in there so I don't get bad results. Where is it? Sticky. There it is. So we had relative, absolute, fixed, or sticky. And actually, a student asked me about this, and I was like, oh, I'm not too sure. I've never really used that before. But the where you would use this is, when you're in your phone and you're in your contact list, and you start scrolling up through all the A's, and the A is stuck at the top. But then when you get to the B's sticks to the top, and then when you get to the C sticks to the top. That's kind of the sticky behavior where the thing will move up. As you scroll, it'll move. The element will move up until it hits a threshold you've defined. When it hits that threshold, maybe the top of the page, it'll stay there until it hits, I think, another threshold, and then maybe now another thing becomes the sticky thing. So there is another option that I didn't put on the slides. I didn't want to go into detail on, but if you're interested in that kind of behavior, it would have to be a positioned element or positioning that would have to be modified for that. Okay. So any questions about the positioning? You should really get away with static on pretty much everything, and with responsive layout, that's probably the best approach. Okay. All right. So now we have selectors. Does anyone want to share with me the difference between my two selectors in this list of two selectors? I have two selectors. Tell me the difference between the two selectors. Yeah. That's right. Yep. That's right, yeah. So these are very different things, because one describes div.primary is a div element with a class primary. That's the only thing it'll match. Whereas div space dot primary, there's a div element somewhere in the document, and one of the descendants of that div element has a class primary. It doesn't have to be the immediate descendant, doesn't have to be a child. It could be grandchild, great-great-grandchild, and it has a class primary. Then the second selector would match it. So we got to be really careful with that space, because this might lead us maybe to the thing we're looking for not being selected, styles not being applied to it, and it was either that we added a space when we didn't need to, or we removed the space when we needed it, right? So just keep that in mind. And what these things are, that space actually has a name. So MDN combinators. So here are some combinators. Oh, where's the? See if there's a better thing for that. I know I have a table somewhere. So here's a bunch of the combinators. Descendant combinator, that's the one we just used. Any descendant. Child combinator, that would have to be specifically the child combinator. There's also, yeah, I know there's one in here too, though. I just don't remember exactly. Oh, it's right. No, this is not bad. So you got a bunch of these combinators. The one we were looking at right now is the space combinator. So I'm going to zoom in for you all. That's what that looks like. Space between the two selectors. You can do a child one. So if you wanted it specifically has to be a child. This would be div greater than dot primary. That would be specifically a div with a child that has a primary class, the class primary. Sibling. That kind of makes sense. Has to be a sibling. So my div and my class, the thing with the class primary, would have to be siblings of each other for that to match here. And then I can do adjacent, which is not just siblings, but next to each other. I don't use these often. I find that maybe you'll see this in my CSS a lot. But when you use things like BEM, these tools become a lot less useful to you, because BEM describes how you actually create a hierarchy without having a specific hierarchy like this. We're saying here that B has to be a descendant of A. With the way that I declare the styles with BEM, it's not necessarily, you don't really think about it that way anymore. But just the main message I wanted to give you was, when you're writing these things out, that could be a source of necessary debugging, right? All right, so we'll talk about specificity. And this is, let's say that we want to apply the exact same style to let's say that we have two selectors that both match an element. Now, if one occurs after the other one, then the second one will be applied. But we have another way to decide what the priority of applying these styles is, and it's through the system of specificity. So what I want to do is identify that with every selector, right? With every selector, we have these elements in the selector. And those elements are broken down into tags. Right? So div, that's an example of a tag. We have classes. Primary is an example of a class. You've also got IDs. You'd have a hash there. But we don't use IDs a lot, right? So that's why I'm not showing you that example. But it is there. IDs are a thing that we have to deal with, right? So each of these types of things that can show up in selectors is going to be given a sort of a priority here. And we're going to go from left being the highest priority to right being the least priority. So tags are less important than classes, are less important than IDs when we're deciding these things. And then, now that we have these an idea of what these different selector classifications are, we can identify the selector we're dealing with. Here it's a P tag. How many IDs are in that selector? 0, right? How many classes are in that first selector? Again, 0. But there's one tag, and so we'll give this a specificity of 001. Okay? That's, now we'll figure out. Now we have one specificity, great. The next one is article space P. How many IDs? 0, right? How many classes? Again, 0, but there's 2 tags. If I have a paragraph, and I have a paragraph that's inside of an article, The paragraph that's inside of an article will definitely that's more specific. That's a more specific selector. So that style would be applied, even though there's another P selector up there that could have been applied otherwise. And we can keep going down this where we say, I've got a tag with 2 classes. So that has a specificity of 0, 2, 1. And that would actually, so 0, 2, 1 would be more specific than 0 to 5 even. Does that, what I'm saying there make sense? That the location of the digits that is the most important thing. Okay. So let's keep going. ID, how many IDs can a thing have? Yeah, so we should expect that would you'd only put 1 in that column for something. But the thing is as soon as something has an ID, that's kind of as specific as we can get on selecting an element. So it's kind of overwrite everything. It doesn't matter if it's the ID. It doesn't matter if there's classes or tags. Yeah. So the question for Calgary is, what happens if I give 2 elements the same ID? I believe it will give it to the last one, but I'm not sure. I haven't really tried. I really don't use IDs a lot, so I'm going to give this one here an ID of I don't know. I'll give them both IDs as static, even though one's not. Oops. Okay, so when I load this up in the browser, they should both have IDs. They have the same ID. That's something we definitely don't want to do. So when I try and document.query, so you're going to learn this tomorrow, selector, I'm trying to now find this thing on the page. I can do it with an ID of static, and it gives me back the static container here that has, it looks like the first one, actually. Yeah, it looks like the first one. So if I were to move this down and run that again, now it found the second one. So it looks like the first one I applied to, that's the one that has that ID. Everything I apply to after does not. Query selector. Yeah, if it answers your question, it's good. If you want to expand it, I'm good with that too. Yeah, I mean, with IDs, we just want to be really using them sparingly. I think there's all sorts of better... the things that I think the only thing I do right now is in React, I have one ID, and it represents the area of my DOM that I want to attach my entire app into. And so when I start my React app, I say, take this app and mount it into this part of the DOM. So I use an ID for that. But after that, I'm not using IDs for pretty much anything. Yeah, so try and use classes as much as possible. It really is a better approach to CSS. Okay. Because with specificity, we can actually maybe solve some of those problems that we would have. Oh, I want to grab this thing. I'll give it an ID. Now I got to think more about making sure these IDs are unique. So maybe I give it an ID, and now it's really easy to select. But if you just kind of understand some of the rules of specificity, maybe you could take a different approach. So here we got the third one: 1 tag, 1 ID, 1 class. So 1, 1, 1. Let's play a little game quickly. We'll do this quick test. What is the specificity of the first rule that I have there? So ID, then class, then tag. So we ask ourselves with the first selector, how many IDs are in there? 0, right? So 0 for the ID column. How many classes are in there? Just the one, right? Anybody not disagree that there's only one class in the first? I'm just looking at the first selector up here. All right, it's a class called warning. So we have 2 tags and 1 class. So we'd have a specificity of 0, 2, 1. Or 0, 1, 2, sorry. 0, 1, 2. What's the next one? What's the specificity of the next selector? One ID, great. Yes, one ID. So that's we're gonna start with one. One class, that sounds good, yeah. And then two yeah, so it should be 112. Great. Is that more specific than the previous one? Yeah, so if I had both of these classes, then when we found the paragraph that is a descendant of a class, something with a class container that is a descendant of a body with an ID home, that would definitely get the color magenta applied to it. Whereas if it was just a div with a class warning that had a descendant of P, that paragraph would get the color cyan applied to it. It's only when two selectors would match the same thing that the specificity could take over. Like the actual same thing, right? So let's look at this next one, which actually is now possible, right? It's not very specific at all. It's pretty much any paragraph tag on the page. We want to set the color to yellow. What's the specificity of this? 001, exactly. And so now I would say that if I had a paragraph that was a descendant of something with a container class that was a descendant of body with an ID home, that thing's also just a paragraph, right? Those things, it might identify those as both matching these selectors, but due to specificity, even no matter what order they are in my style files, specificity will determine which one actually gets applied. Okay. Do we want to do the last one or not? Here. Seems like we're getting a little bored. So, most specific, this one right here. We've got two with IDs, so it's going to definitely be one of those two, but one of them actually has some classes on it, and that's going to up the specificity for us. Okay. So these style tags, the one that I showed you a little bit about this morning, that's the most specific you got to get. As soon as I put a style right on an element like that, the specificity rules are kind of thrown out. Color will be whatever that is there. And then we've got this thing called important. So my div element has color mint, and I find that to be very important. And I can just say, I load up my page, and my style's not being applied to it. And I go and look in the tools, and I say, oh, there's this other style being applied to it instead. Well, then I just go into my rule, and I say, no, this is more important. So I can define that using this exclamation mark, important. And then I go into my browser, and I see that my style is now being applied to that. Can anyone kind of think of a situation where, like, if I start using that as my solution, then I make everything important. And then if everything's important, like, what's important? This is the problem, right? So we want to be really careful with these approaches. Use them. We're not going to really have a good reason to use them for this project. For maybe your midterms, you might find it, but ask a mentor for help and see if there's an alternative to using important. I find people use important a lot when they're working with things like Bootstrap and other CSS frameworks, where they're like, well, Bootstrap just keeps putting this thing on here. It was quite specific. I can't be more specific than they are, so I'm going to have to put important in there, but that's 1, and I only get 10 for the entire project, or something like that, right? Maybe you create a budget for the number of importance that you can add, and if you're going to put important on something else, you need to remove it from something first before you put it on there, right? Maybe you do stuff like that. I'm just trying to show you how this can be. You can get back into the exact same situation. Because if two elements are both important, well, we go back to specificity, right? So we have to know this anyways. Okay. So that's all about specificity, position, and I want to spend, a little bit later than I thought, but we've got grid layout now. We'll talk about grid layout. And this is, when I learned about the grid, it was from designers that I was working with. And they would deliver to me these Photoshop documents that they represent mock-ups of the different screens that you would build, different pages or screens or whatever. And if you sometimes, very rarely they would forget to remove or hide the grid. But sometimes if you open up the document, you'd see this layer called grid, and you click on that, and it would show you these like lines over top of the entire design, because they used it to lay out the elements in their Photoshop document. So they started to give these things. I'm like, well, wait a second. This is actually, if this is your process, then maybe we should also lay out our page using a grid like this, because then we can just match from the design to the document. So things like this, CSS grids, usually what it is, it's a system allows you to break a screen down into maybe 12 or 16 or some number of columns. The reason we choose 12 is because one means that they're relatively good width, not too wide, but also pretty good size, but also divisible by 3 and 4 and 6 and 2. So I can start to create multi-column spans where the first row there, those are all one sort of one value columns, I guess, or they only span the width of one column. Whereas I can also say on the second row that I want this thing to span 2 of these columns that I've defined, and then I can say 3 or 4 or 6, and so this thing here, these 2 6, I can have something split the screen in half, put something on one side, put something on the other, and I can start to get into this kind of a flow, right, where I actually break my designs down into this, and my sidebar is 3 columns wide, and my content is how many columns? 9 columns? 12 columns minus 3, right? So I've got my footers down here, so each one of those takes up 4 columns. Okay, so this is what I was getting to with Bootstrap, providing some of this capability. And the API they use, again, is let's see, it looks kind of like a good example. That's not bad. So this is kind of how they would define that. And so I would define my code maybe as a row. Well, if I were trying to create this layout, how many rows are there? Just in this part, in the lower half that's highlighted, how many rows are in there? 5? Okay. So how did you count 5? I'll bring this in. So I would say that if each one of these are a row, so that's 5 rows, right? I'm talking about just down here. How many rows would I need to build this type of a layout using a grid? I have 1 row on the top for my navigation. That's 1 row. And that row spans 12 columns, so it takes up the entire width of the browser. Then I have a second row below that, and that row is pretty much all of the menu and the content of my website. And the sidebar and the content are in the same row. Sidebar takes 3 columns, the other one takes 9 columns. And then we have a third row for the stuff that goes underneath all that, which is my footer at the bottom. And I might have a column for my information about my business, column for things like careers and hiring and all that, another column for my latest Instagram post, whatever it is. I can put that in there, but I can break it up like this, 3 rows, and each row can have the number of columns that it needs to display the content that it has. So this is actually how I think a lot more about design. And if you start working with interface designers, it's very possible they deliver documents that have this column idea in it. So how would we actually build this? Let's see. I've got a grid here. So I've got this. Okay. And it's not great, but it kind of works. As I load it up, grab grid.html, and we'll see that I start off by defining a row, and that row has 12 columns. And then I define my second row, and it has 6 columns, but each one spans 2 columns wide, etc. And then we hit this part down here, which is where I'm actually defining that application. And this is how, you're not going to be doing this for Tweeter, you're not going to be using this, but in your midterm, using something like Bootstrap's grid system definitely is a recommendation. So you might have to start using containers with rows and columns in them, right? So here's my first row. My first row, it takes the entire span, so I'll say that it is a 12-column row. The second one here, it's a row that takes that has a sidebar and content, so we'll define those here. And I actually can give them the class that describes how far they span, how many columns they span, and then any other classes I want to change to change their look, I can put a bunch of these classes on here. What else? We got the row. So if I'm going to do this, I need to start to create styles that match this. I need to have a row that represents, again, one of these rows, and I have to have these things, columns. Do I create styles for each of these? Call 1, call 2, call 3. So let's look at what approach I took. All right. The very top of my document. Is anyone unfamiliar with this? We talked about it this morning, right? So why am I doing, at the top, why am I setting the box sizing to be border box? Has more to do with the way, is sort of when I add padding, I don't want it to add to the actual width of the thing. Like if I say that its width is 12% or something like that, I don't want the padding to have any impact on that. I want to still take 12% of this screen up. So I'm doing this just to make sure that my padding and my borders don't actually impact the size of the box element that I'm creating here. And the alternative, the default, is content box. Okay. I decided to use div row overflow, I think, hidden for this. So this is my clear fix, I believe. Yeah. So I went with that option instead of that other clear fix option. It's supported in my browser, so it doesn't really hurt. Fewer things to type, that kind of thing. And then this is an interesting one. So let's go over this quickly because this is kind of cool. Does anyone want to guess what I'm trying to do here? Sorry, which? That's right, exactly. That's what I'm trying to do here. So instead of having to create a class for call 1, call 2, call 3, call 4, call 6, I guess, or call 1, 2, 4, and 6. All of the columns should be floated left. All of them should have a right padding, right? So I bring up the inspector. Oops. We can see these elements have padding. The padding, the green padding there. And I want to apply that to all of my columns, but I don't want to have I don't want to have to duplicate all of this. So you're exactly right. I am applying these styles to any div that has a class that starts with col hyphen. That's what this does. And then, so with that, I apply float to everything. We all understand why I'm applying float to all these columns, so that I can give them a height if I want to. And actually even, a height, and still have them stack horizontally. So I'm giving everything a padding right of 20 pixels. What do we think this rule is for? That selector, very similar to the previous one. What's it doing? Exactly, yeah. So the last one on the right does not have padding. I apply right padding to absolutely every column, and then in the next style, I apply no padding to the right of the last column. So here's how it looks. First column has padding. Second column has padding. Third column is the last of the type in this container, so it has no padding because we set the padding back to 0 here. Okay. Sometimes I do that. Sometimes it'll just be easier for me to do that rather than because setting this here and then overriding it. I believe that both will actually match that last element. If I go in here, see? Yeah. It matches this still, but later on we just overwrite it with another thing. Happens. Should definitely use that if you need to. Sometimes I'll do that if I want to set the border to 0, and then I want to just add a bottom border. Well, I would set the whole border to 0, and then I would add a border just to the bottom, because I don't know necessarily how that. I think by default. Yeah, I'm not sure, actually. All right. So now the last part of this is going to look pretty repetitive. And I said I didn't want to create a class for each one of these, but I did create a class a class for each of these. But the nice thing is I did not have to do this, right? This is all I was trying to avoid. I don't want to do it that way. So what I did instead was I used 2 selectors to match column 1. Now, column 1 is being set to width 8.33 repeated. Where do we think I got that number from? Yeah, 1/12, exactly. It's 1 divided by 12 gives me 8.3 repeated. 2 divided by 12 is giving me 16.6. This one's a bit easier to do in my head, right? 3 divided by 12, I'm going to get 25% on that one. Okay. So this is just all of the columns and what percentage value they'd have. So I take the column number, I divide it by 12, and I get back a number, a percentage, okay? There are much better ways to do this nowadays. Again, this is showing you how it would have been done or would be done in the past, and how Bootstrap probably did it for many, many years. Until Flexbox was popular enough that they could just switch over in Bootstrap 4 to use Flexbox instead of this type of a technique. But Bootstrap 4, when did that come out? Is it even out yet? I don't know. Good. Yeah, it's out now. I wonder when it was released, because I don't know where I'd find a date. So they've got version 4.0. This looks like their final release. So what I've done here is on GitHub, instead of going, I choose the branch. I go over to tags. Usually people that release software will tag the commits to this commit is the one that we actually ended up releasing. The next version comes out, we tag that with the release. So we can see these are all the different versions that they've released from this. They were in 4.0 for a long time, beta 3. 4.0 here. This was... looks like January 18th. They around that time is when they released 4.0. So switched over completely to Flexbox, but before that, they were using something kind of like this to do their with floats and percentages like this. Okay. So let's actually take that and try and apply that concept of grids to how we would design a tweeter, or how we would build a tweeter using grids instead. Just so you know, I'm also using normalized CSS, so I load that first. The very top. I load normalized.css, and then I load that exact same grid file that I just showed you. Right, the one that I had in that other document, I'm loading it here as well. Has all those call 1, call 2 things. Then I have some styles specific to my layout here. So these ones are, usually if I need something, if I want my whole page to take up the entire screen, even when there's only content to take up the top, well, then I need to set the height of that container, which my whole container is the HTML or the body. I have to set that up to 100% so it stretches out. And that's so that actually, let's take this and see what it looks like if I don't apply some of these properties. So in the HTML here, right? If I don't put the height of the entire document to be 100 to take up the window, and I have no content in there, well, then there's nothing that says this thing should be bigger than 0. Now I add height 100 on it, 100%, and now it says, no, this thing is 100% height no matter what. I don't care if there's content in there or not, right? Okay. Yeah, background color and font, we can do that. I think I've included the font here using Google Fonts, so then I just reference it in my document. Always, always, always have a backup here. Okay, so I've decided I want this font called Newton, but it is a serif font. It means it has these little beaks and stuff on them, right? That's what a serif font is. So I would say, well, if you don't find Newton, at least please use a serif font so it looks somewhat like what I want it to, right? And alternatively, I would say font family, like something like Arial. Okay, great. If you don't have Arial, sans serif then. So don't do something that's at least somewhat resembles Arial, which means it doesn't have all these little serifs on it. Okay. So next thing, I've got this header here. That's going to be my first row of my grid, right? The header. How many columns are in that header? How many columns do you think you would need? Anybody? 12? So one spans 12 though, right? Like one column will span all 12 of them. So technically we'll have one column, but it'll be the size of it. Okay, so that's one way to do it for sure. But then I get into this situation where I might need to take that button and float it to the right so it goes all the way over there. So I made a different decision because of that. Instead of adding floats to my button to make it go to the right side of this whole big header thing, instead what I did is I actually made this two different columns. And this column has an alignment where everything goes to the left, and this column has an alignment where everything just goes to the right. So I was able to split it up that way instead. I didn't have to use a float right on that button. Again, it's kind of a preference, but just to show you that you can use that as a technique to split these elements up. Even though my nav bar at the top looks completely like it is the one thing to the user, I was able to get what I wanted out of it by splitting it into two. Okay. And here's what that looks like. My header, I've hard-coded the height to be 80 pixels. And my header is right here. It's a row that spans 6 columns on the left side that has the logo and the image in it and the text. And then on the right side, it has that as well. And then I've got a class or button here called Compose. And my class Compose has text align right. But that's how I got it there, right? That's how I got this thing. So let's find text align right here. So it seems like it doesn't actually care if it's actually text or it could be a button too. Probably any inline element, actually, now that I think about it. Any inline element should probably behave like that. Okay. All right, what's next? So now we got, so that's one row, 2 columns. What's the next row? How many columns in the next row? Question is, okay, so do they always evenly distribute and are they always the same size? I would say you probably always want to span at the end the entire 12 columns, whether or not that's a combination of 12 single elements or a combination, or like 3 elements each spanning 4, or 3 elements where 2 of them span 1 and then the other one spans 10. That's okay as well. Any of that is fine with this, yeah. Okay, so I'm going to say there are 3 columns here. I've got the left and the right side, that's my gutters. And then I've got the middle part, which is where my content goes. I didn't hard code that to be 450 pixels wide. I think that's what you were meant to do. And again, this does not follow the design of what you're doing, but I thought I would just show you how we would do this using a basic grid instead. And how layout can actually be applied to maybe something that you're a bit more familiar with. The last thing, yeah, so this is what the content looks like. I said this one's 2. I could look at it and say, yeah, actually, you know what? I want less room for my text. I could change all these and make this a 6 here. And that just really just changes the percentage space that takes. Okay. Let's see. I don't think there's anything else in here that's very interesting. Did I even need to do that? The title thing? Let's see. Is this my title? I don't like that. No. Found a problem. Not necessarily a problem, right? Like, does it matter if I leave this in here or not? There's nothing after it, right? In that same container, so the clearfix stuff doesn't really matter too much. So maybe I actually, for me though, as I build a layout like this, and I do this when I sit down with you and with a review or something like that, it's, oh, well, hey, this thing doesn't look like it belongs. Oh, yeah, I was right, it doesn't belong, it doesn't do anything, right? Didn't actually need this. Oh, but that actually did do something. I can see the effect of this property right on this document here. I can see up in my title, it's changing the font size. I can see the line height. That's what I use to center this vertically. That also has an effect, but what doesn't have an effect is this float left. So what I would do, I'd just get rid of that, right? Like if I don't need it, I shouldn't have that in there. Potentially, it could cause a problem. I leave that in there, and then I try to add another element after the tweeter, and then I see, why is that happening? That's kind of weird. So keep that in mind as you're writing these things. What you're going to do, you're going to create a style definition to find the thing you want to change. And then you're going to start to add some styles to it, and it's going to start to change in the way that you want, and eventually you're going to get where you want. But chances are you go back and you click on the check marks between each of those, and it's very likely that at least one of those styles didn't actually do anything at the end, right? Like maybe you added position absolute and then top left, and then you got rid of position absolute, but didn't remove the top and left because you didn't really think about it. Go in there, clean that stuff up before you submit it. Definitely a tip, okay? And again, like I said, when I sit down at your desk, I open up this tool, and I'm like, oh, well, that's not really, doesn't do anything, does it? Why do you have it in there? If you have a good reason for it, leave it. If you don't have a good reason, keep it out of there because complexity grows. All right. So I'd say after you're a bit more comfortable with the difference between block and inline, and you've used this float, go right to Flexbox. Definitely good for making layouts like this, and also vertically centering things. If you need to vertically center anything, Flexbox is going to make it happen, within this millennium, rather than having to spend multiple years on it. There's also this grid system that works better for two-dimensional layouts. Because here, when I say Flexbox only works on one dimension, but I can create multi-dimensional layouts. I can create layouts that have, this is a multi-dimensional layout. Right? I can flex things this way, I can flex things this way. So you can start to nest flex elements and say that I have a flex from one container. I use Flexbox to have navigation for all the rows, and then with each of those rows, those also have a flex display, but they would be horizontal. Maybe the navigation doesn't even need it, but the sidebar and content they might. So, yeah, I'd play around with that. Midterm, maybe after the midterm. Grid, again, multi-dimensional layout. So if I'm actually trying to create more of these more of these modern things, I'm probably going to try and go with this. Because I can define both dimensions in the same rules, rather than having to think about it as a whole bunch of some vertical, some horizontal, right? So, feel good? Someone? No, you don't have to. It's boot camp. You're not supposed to. You're just not supposed to be comfortable with all of this. Any questions before I sign off? No? What about Calgary? I see you speaking with Karam. I don't know what. You just like him more or what? I don't know. Definitely, I looked at the history on like Thursday or whatever, and yeah, I don't know. Okay, if there's nothing, then I'm done. And again, message me on Slack if you need anything tonight or tomorrow. All right.